Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of True Crime with Caitlyn. This is part 2 of my coverage of the case of Elizabeth Smart. In my last episode, I took you through Elizabeth's background, her terrifying kidnap, the investigation, suspects, and how Elizabeth was finally found. This episode is going to centre around what was happening to Elizabeth during that time, so make sure to go ahead and give the other episode a listen first so that you're all caught up. And with all that being said, this is the incredible survival story of Elizabeth Smart. After attending an awards ceremony at her middle school, where 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart brought home awards for academic excellence and physical fitness, the Smart family returned back to their home in Federal Heights, Salt Lake City, Utah. They enjoyed a family meal, which Mother Lois had quickly thrown together before all heading to bed. Elizabeth shared a bedroom and double bed with her younger sister, 9-year-old Mary Catherine, and the girls were both tucked into bed and wished goodnight by their father, who gave them both a goodnight kiss. It was around 2 a.m. on what was now the 5th of June 2002 when Elizabeth is awoken by a strange voice and something cold, sharp, pressing onto her neck. The threatening voice said to her, quote, "I have a knife to your neck. Do not make a sound. Get out of bed and come with me or I will kill you and your family." Momentarily, Elizabeth didn't know what was going on. Surely she was dreaming. Surely there wasn't a strange man stood beside her in the comfort, safety and security of her own bedroom with a knife held at her neck, threatening her. But that is exactly what was happening. Elizabeth was snapped out of whatever dream she thought she was having when she felt the man grab her arm and pull her out of her bed. Lay beside Elizabeth, Mary Catherine had heard the entire thing, and she lay completely frozen in terror and fear. As I mentioned in my last episode, she would lie there for around about 2 hours before going to tell her parents what had happened, and during that time she must have misremembered or misheard what the man threatened Elizabeth saying, because Mary Catherine was under the impression that Elizabeth had been taken by gunpoint. After being pulled from her bed, Elizabeth was ordered to just pull on any pair of shoes that she could grab, and the first ones she picked up happened to be a pair of tennis shoes. The man would march Elizabeth through her own home at knife point and forced her to climb through the kitchen window where he had entered by cutting open the window screen. Elizabeth was terrified. She didn't know if this man had already went from room to room killing her entire family and then taking her. He had threatened that he would or could do it, so what was to say that he hadn't already? How hadn't her parents realised that something was going on? This kidnapper was clearly a very dangerous man who was capable of inflicting horror, and his name was Brian David Mitchell. Brian was born in October 1953 in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the middle of 6 children and was raised as a part of a very religious, strict Mormon family. Neighbours would describe Brian's parents, Irene and Cheryl, as, quote, odd but decent people. Growing up, Brian seemed very normal. He was involved in the church and he would do sports after school. In order to try and teach Brian some independence, his father, Cheryl, would drive him out to a remote, unfamiliar area, kick him out of the car, and then told his son that he had to find his own way home. Cheryl also exposed Brian to explicit pictures from him being as young as 8 years old to try and teach him about sex. Now, I have a 6-year-old who is almost 7, so I know for a fine fact that showing those photos to an 8-year-old and having those conversations is way too early. Because of that early exposure, Brian probably saw nothing wrong with some of his actions that followed. He would once be beaten by Cheryl after Cheryl discovered that Brian had been playing doctors with some of the young children in their street when he was a teenager. On another occasion, when he was 16 years old, he was actually charged for exposing himself to a minor, and for this, he was sent to juvenile prison. Following his release, he lived a chaotic lifestyle, which I'm not going to deep dive into. In short, he would go through a string of marriages where he was a physical and mental abuser. He would father some children, he would sexually abuse his stepchildren, and he began abusing drugs and alcohol. After divorcing from his second wife, the very day that the divorce was finalised, 32-year-old Brian would marry Wanda Barzee. Wanda was a 40-year-old divorced mother of 6 who was a committed member to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The two met while attending a group therapy session. Wanda, who was described as quiet, shy, a follower, was there to help her get through a very hard divorce that she was going through. She had been married to her husband for 20 years, but now they were divorcing. Wanda was struggling mentally, and so she was going to therapy for help. During the session where she and Brian met, Wanda was feeling very emotional, and as sort of a comfort, Brian would take hold of her hand. And I guess for these two, it must have been love at first sight. Wanda's children who lived with the couple would describe their relationship as strange, and that Brian was very threatening towards Wanda, who was submissive in return. She would do whatever Brian wanted, no questions asked, and would even encourage some of his behaviour. Once, as a punishment for one of Wanda's young daughters, Brian murdered her pet rabbit and then fed it to her. He served this young girl her pet rabbit for her evening meal for her tea, telling her that it was just chicken. The next day, when she went to check on her rabbit, who she had given the name Peaches, she noticed that Peaches was gone. She asked her mother where Peaches was, to which Wanda responded, quote, "You had her for dinner last night." Wanda was a very cold mother who didn't really nurture her children. They lived in a constant fear of stepping out of line or doing the wrong thing, which if they did would result in a beating. After apparently being visited by angels in his dreams, Brian became very extreme with his religious views and thought of himself as God's prophet, having a revelation and being the only person that God was speaking directly to. He and Wanda would go on to devote their life to God, but not now identifying as Mormons, I believe. This version of God was whatever Brian said he was. Wanda left behind her 6 children to follow Brian in whatever he was going to do. So when he told her that they were going to develop survival skills, live on the land, off the land, and off the generosity of others by street preaching and begging, she followed him blindly. When he told her that he needed 7 young wives, she had no qualms. Not even when Brian had came up with a plan that he was going to kidnap a 14-year-old girl to make his first wife. And he already knew who that girl was going to be. Brian David Mitchell had been begging outside of a shop in Salt Lake City in November 2001 when he caught Lois Smart's attention. She thought that Brian looked like someone who was going through a bit of a bad patch and just needed a little help. She rifled through her bag for some money to give to Brian, and while she did so, he fixated on her oldest daughter stood beside her. This was Elizabeth Smart. And from that very moment, he knew that he had to have her. He was going to take her. Lois would hand Brian $5 and told him to contact her husband Ed as they were on renovating their house and maybe Ed would have some work for him. Which when Brian reached out to Ed, Ed said that he did. Brian would show up to the Smart Federal Heights home and he only stayed doing work with Ed on the roof and in the garden for a couple of hours on one singular day. His interactions with anyone in the house on this day within these couple of hours were minimal. Ed said that Brian had only saw or spoke, interacted with the children for maybe 5 minutes in passing. After that day, Brian David Mitchell would return to the house one final time, but not for work. He returned to kidnap Elizabeth. After snatching Elizabeth Smart from her bed, Brian led her out into the dark street, guiding her where to walk. Out of nowhere, headlights of a police car appeared in the distance, and before Elizabeth even had a second to register what she was seeing, Brian had dragged her to the ground where they were hidden behind some bushes. He threatened to kill her if she moved or made a sound. The first thing that she thought was that her parents knew that she was gone. They knew that she had been taken, and they were already on the case trying to find her, to rescue her, to bring her back home. Next to her on the ground, while still pointing the knife towards Elizabeth, Brian prayed out loud, saying, quote, "If this is the work of God, then let this police car pass without finding us." As we know, it wouldn't be until hours later that Lois and Ed contacted the police, and so this car, which must have just been a car driving about on patrol, drove past Elizabeth and Brian. Brian taking this as a sign from God to continue. For the next few hours, Elizabeth would be forced to hike high up into the mountains out the back of her house. They actually hiked up so high that they reached the summit or the peak, and then they went down the other side of the mountain. Throughout the hours of hiking, Elizabeth thought she knew what was going to happen to her. She had heard these stories before, and she knew how these stories usually ended. Kidnapped children don't come back home, at least not alive. She tried to reason and plead with Brian to take her back home, but when that didn't work, she chillingly asked him something that no 14-year-old should ever have to ask.
If you're going to rape and kill me, would you please just do it here so that my parents can find my body, so that they can find my remains, so they can know what happened to me?
To this, he responded with a grin on his face, "I'm not going to kill you yet." Brian led Elizabeth to a makeshift campsite that was heavily camouflaged. The area of the mountain had been levelled out. There was a tent and some tarp, and clearly a lot of time and effort had been put into creating the campsite. When they arrived, Elizabeth was greeted by Wanda Barzee, who opened up her arms and pulled her in for a hug. But this wasn't like a tenderly, motherly, "I'm here for your" hug. It was Wanda establishing a power dynamic. Elizabeth was in her house. Wanda sat a terrified Elizabeth down on a bucket inside of the tent and ordered her to take off her pajamas and her underwear. Immediately, Elizabeth refused. She recalled being a very shy, self-conscious girl as it was, never mind being forced from your home by a strange, dangerous man, and now this crazy-looking lady is telling you to strip. Elizabeth continued to refuse, begging Wanda to allow her to keep her clothes on, but she wasn't having any of it. Wanda coldly told her that if she didn't take them off, Brian would come in and rip them off her back. Elizabeth decided to go with the former, removing her cosy red pajamas and underwear, both of which were later burnt. Wanda proceeded to give Elizabeth a rubby-down sponge bath, and Elizabeth again tried to protest against this, saying that she was clean, she had only just had a bath or shower before she went to bed. But Wanda persisted. She needed to be clean for what was coming. In some sort of sick ceremony, Wanda married Elizabeth and Brian, and in response and realization, Elizabeth cried, screamed out, "No!" when Brian threatened her, saying, quote, "If you ever scream out like that again, I will kill you. If it'll help you to not scream out, I can duct tape your mouth shut." After the quote-unquote wedding, Elizabeth was taken back into the tent by Brian, where he told her that she was now his wife and he expected her to do her wifely duties. Confused, again Elizabeth tried to reason with him. They weren't married. This wasn't legal. How was this happening? And what did he mean by wifely duties? And then she realised what was about to happen was her worst nightmare. Brian told her that it was time to compensate their marriage. Elizabeth would be dragged off of the bucket where she sat, kicking and screaming, and was raped by Brian David Mitchell for the first time. Throughout her entire 9 months being held as his captive, she would endure being raped by him daily, sometimes multiple times a day, and there wasn't a period of 24 hours when she wasn't raped at least once. Again, this is a 14-year-old girl. When she awoke the following day, Elizabeth would discover a metal wire or cord which had been wrapped around her ankle and bolted together. This was tethered to a tree, meaning that she was truly trapped. Even if she wanted to chance it and try and make a run for it, she couldn't. She was their prisoner. By now, the ground search for Elizabeth was underway, and I think that Brian and Wanda didn't realise, or at least underestimated, just how big the search for Elizabeth would be. At one point, some of the searchers who were going around the mountains actually got really close to the campsite. They got so close that Elizabeth could hear her name being called out, and what is more devastating, heartbreaking, is that she recognised one of the voices as being her beloved Uncle Tom. He called out for Elizabeth, and it probably took everything in her to not scream back out to him, but she couldn't. During this period, Brian would sit staring into her eyes with his beady eyes, holding a knife towards her, and once again told her, "I will kill you if you make a noise. I will kill whoever comes up here to find you. If they ever get into this camp, I will kill them." He had manipulated Elizabeth, drilling it into her that if she made a sound or called out or made herself be discovered, he would murder whoever walked in, whoever found her, but first he would make her watch him do it, and then he would murder her. On another occasion, helicopters flew directly above the camp, and Elizabeth was all but thrown into the tent. Despite the camp being heavily camouflaged, Brian wasn't going to be taking any chances. Elizabeth recalled watching as the helicopters circled above her head and then flew away, never returning. Those are just a few of the many times that Elizabeth was almost discovered. Quite early on in her captivity, Elizabeth decided that she wasn't going to let Brian and Wanda win. They weren't going to break her. She was going to power through, stay strong, and do anything that she could to survive, even if that meant being trapped with them until she outlived them, till they died of old age and left her behind. She had prepared herself that that could be a possibility. This could be her life for the next 30 plus years, but she was determined that she was going to survive this. During her captivity, Elizabeth would essentially become a slave for Wanda Barzee. She was forced to drink alcohol and use drugs. Brian had a history of smoking weed, so potentially it was that drug, but I don't believe any specific drug or drugs have been named as to what he forced Elizabeth to use. We do know that he would force Elizabeth to look at explicit pornographic material to show her what he wanted them to do. All of these things obviously so inappropriate for Elizabeth's age, and it is absolutely disgusting that he was doing it, but they were all also things that her faith had taught her not to do. She followed the Word of Wisdom health code, and only just before her kidnap, Elizabeth had taken her pledge, pledging not to drink alcohol or use drugs and abstain from sex until marriage. These things he did were to break her, to have further control and manipulation over Elizabeth. She remembered thinking after being raped that if her family found out, they might not want her anymore. She felt useless, worthless, dirty, and all of those things which were just absolutely not true. But all of those things Brian could use against her, and he did. He told Elizabeth that she was evil, wicked, and sinful. Even though he is the one that is inflicting all of this on her, he is the one that is forcing her to do these things against her free will. Alongside those things, Elizabeth would go through periods of being starved and dehydrated, and it was actually during a period where she was severely dehydrated that she got a very well needed push and some encouragement to keep going. She had continued her own prayers to God, and on this one specific evening, she awoke in the middle of the night, her mouth dry as sticks, and there, in front of her, was an ice-cold cup of water. She had no idea where it came from, but she knew for a fine fact that it wasn't from her captors. She wholeheartedly believed that this was a sign from God, later saying, quote, "I could just feel the cold water running down inside of me and just how grateful I was for it. And just feeling like it was God telling me that I wasn't forgotten, that He still knew I was there and that He wasn't abandoning me." As time passed, Elizabeth eventually had the chain from her ankle removed so that she could walk freely within the very small camp. Brian would still do his usual thing of going down into Salt Lake City, preaching, begging, bringing back bits and pieces of food and what have you. This is why I believe that Wanda was just as evil as Brian, because she had many opportunities to let Elizabeth go, but she never did. Sometimes, when returning back to the campsite, Brian would talk all about what was going on down there in the city, what was happening with the investigation into Elizabeth's kidnapping. Now, if you remember from the FBI profile that I spoke about in the last episode, that is absolutely spot on. Brian would tell Elizabeth that the whole city was covered in beautiful blue ribbons and balloons, that her face was on every tree, in every shop, everywhere you looked, there was a missing person poster with her face on it. He had actually taken one of the posters and brought it back up to the campsite to show Elizabeth. He told her that everyone was looking for her, but they would never find her because he had her and God was protecting him. Brian would completely strip away Elizabeth's identity, who she was, and what she stood for. As I mentioned, he forced her to do things that she didn't want to do, things that were completely out of her character. Her pajamas were burnt upon her arrival to the camp, and she was given a white, greyish robe dress thing to wear, which matched what Brian and Wanda wore. And eventually, he forced Elizabeth to drop her name. Throughout the time of this case, they would go through a string of aliases and fake names, but just to keep this episode simple and easy to follow, I'm going to continue calling them by their real names. When Brian felt like he really had his claws into Elizabeth, that he had terrified her into total submission, he actually started taking her out of the campsite in the mountains and down into Salt Lake, the city where everyone and their dog were looking for her. She and Wanda would wear face coverings alongside their head-to-toe robes, so their identity was completely concealed and neither of them were allowed to speak in public. If anyone stopped to talk to them, Brian would be the one doing all of the talking, and he would introduce the two people with him as his wife and his daughter. The three would often be spotted in Salt Lake, and if you go and Google this case, you can see some of the pictures that people took of the three of them just out and about in Salt Lake City. They would be spotted in homeless shelters, sometimes out begging, other times in restaurants. They went to big house parties, they were seen on the bus, they got about, and they were even spotted walking nearby Elizabeth's house. Brian David Mitchell must have got a kick from this because he was dangling the carrot in front of the donkey. He must have felt invincible walking around in plain sight, kidnapped Elizabeth Smart by his side, and no one knew. But there was an instance that scared him. One time that Elizabeth got close to being discovered. It was in September 2002, 3 months following the kidnapping of Elizabeth, and winter was creeping into Utah. Even Brian recognised that living in the mountains, exposed to the elements, wasn't feasible during the winter. In Salt Lake City, Utah, it could get right down to -7, and so they would have to go somewhere else where it was warmer. The three were sat inside of the library looking through some books. Brian was actually trying to plan where they were going to go when the police approached them. Someone in the library had been looking at the three and they couldn't shake the feeling that the young girl, despite only being able to see her pale complexion and blue eyes, could be Elizabeth. Police approached their table and, as usual, Elizabeth and Wanda stayed silent. Police asked Brian why the women had veils over their faces, and he said that these were his wife and his daughter, and their faces were covered to protect them from the sins of the world as they were ministers of Christ. I can imagine not even really knowing what to respond to that. Police pushed back, however, and I gather they probably said something like, "We've got this missing young girl. If we could just see your daughter's face, we'll be able to say that she is not the missing young girl, and then we'll be on our way." But to that, Brian said no. He told the officers that he was protecting his daughter ahead of her future marriage. The only men who were allowed to see her face were himself, her father, and her future husband. Both of these officers were neither one of them, not her father nor her future husband, and if they forced this young girl to show them her face, they would be violating her. Brian had a way of being able to talk his way out of anything, and it worked. The officers didn't push any further, and they left without seeing who was under the veil. Throughout this entire interaction, Wanda Barzee had an iron hand grip on Elizabeth's leg just in case she needed that physical warning. That close call was enough for Brian David Mitchell, and shortly after, the three of them jumped on a bus heading to California, just over 800 miles away. While here, they would sleep in a dried out riverbed, and they had their Christmas dinner within a homeless shelter. Brian continued preaching and begging, and he even got incarcerated at one point. He had been committing a robbery when he was caught red-handed, photographed with his big bushy beard and wild long hair, then taken into custody where he sat in jail for 3 days or so. At this point in time, back in Utah, Mary Catherine had had her realization that the person who took Elizabeth was Emmanuel, which was one of Brian's fake names. Elizabeth's case had been broadcasted on America's Most Wanted, and everyone was searching for Brian David Mitchell. However, in San Diego, they apparently never got the memo because he was in their custody as this was beginning, and he would be eventually freed. Brian was still on his mission to kidnap and marry 7 young girls. He had successfully kidnapped Elizabeth, but had 2 other attempted kidnappings, which thankfully failed. Back in Utah, only weeks after kidnapping Elizabeth, he tried to kidnap her cousin Olivia. He didn't realise that when he got to Olivia's house and to her bedroom window that she had actually swapped bedrooms with her older sister, who he had awoken trying to break into her room. That, as I said in my last episode, police brushed off as a cruel prank when it was reported, but it wasn't. It was Brian David Mitchell trying to strike again. If they had took that report seriously and thoroughly investigated it more, maybe they would have figured that out. In San Diego, California, Brian attempted to kidnap another young girl. She was 15 years old, but again, he was unsuccessful in this. He had started to get itchy feet and discussed with Wanda moving again to a bigger city where there would be more girls for him to prey on. He mentioned wanting to go all the way to New York or even to Boston on the other side of the country. Inside, Elizabeth told herself that if he took her all that way, she would truly never be found. No one recognised her on the streets of her own city where her face was plastered. So there was no way that anyone would know who she was 2,500 miles away. At least if she was in Utah, she still felt close or at home or at least somewhere familiar. This is when Elizabeth had the genius to begin to manipulate her captor just as he had done to her for months. Elizabeth told Brian that she just had this feeling that God had spoken to her and was telling her to go back to Utah, but she wasn't sure. She knew she was too wicked, she was too evil and sinful, too unworthy for God to want to speak to her, but she just couldn't shake it. She asked Brian, playing up to him because she didn't truly believe that he actually spoke to God, if he could check with God as his prophet, if that's where they were in fact supposed to go. By some miracle, Brian David Mitchell agreed they should go back to Utah. Unbeknownst to him, by now, everyone was on the hunt for him and he was about to walk right into their hands. The three would hitchhike their way back to Utah, and while walking down a street in Sandy, which is about 20 minutes away from Salt Lake, police would pull them over, wanting to speak to them. 2 separate phone calls had been made by members of the public who had seen America's Most Wanted. They saw this trio walking down and believed that they were looking at Brian David Mitchell and maybe Elizabeth. Here is a recording from some of the officers at the scene on how they discovered Elizabeth.
When I got out of my car, I stopped them, asked them if they would stop and talk to me. I had some questions for them. I asked them what their names were. They gave me Peter Marshall, Juliet Marshall, and Augustine Marshall.
But this girl standing off to the side really stood out to me because she had this disguise on. It just didn't fit.
She was wearing a wig, a gray-haired wig, claiming that she was 17 or 18. She was the only one out of 3 wearing some sort of disguise. So once we kind of keyed into, well, she does kind of look like Elizabeth Smart.
She then said something like, I think you know who I think I am, but I'm not that person. And I said, well, who do you think we think you are? And she says, you think I'm that Elizabeth Smart girl. She says, well, I'm not that girl. I held up the poster right next to her face and said, Elizabeth, this is you. She says, no, that's not me.
At one point I could see her t-shirt actually moving. Her heart was pounding very fast in her chest.
Her eyes welled up with tears. You could tell she wanted just to physically say it, but she wouldn't. And I says, Elizabeth, just for your peace of mind and your families, tell me that you're Elizabeth Smart. And she says, thou say it then. And I said, excuse me? She says, thou say it. I've never heard that before. It's a biblical phrase. And I says, well, I'll take that as a yes then.
A point that I really want to make before we get into wrapping up this episode is some people ask, why? Why didn't Elizabeth call out for help when she had the opportunity? Why did she try to conceal her identity? Why did she deny that she was Elizabeth? Why didn't she try to run away any and every chance that she got? And I think that what I'm about to say is a very important insight. The control that Brian had over Elizabeth was powerful. He didn't even need to be stood with her in order to maintain it. He had gotten this power by terrifying her, traumatizing her, and breaking her down. He repeatedly made threats to her life and to her family's life, and Elizabeth had every reason to believe that he would follow through on these threats. He had already shown her what a monster he was. He had led by example by physically kidnapping her from the security, safety, and comfort of her own home. So he had proven that if he could do that and everything else that followed, he was capable of going even further. He was able to break into her home to kidnap her, so what was stopping him by breaking into it again and plunging a knife into the neck of every single member of her family? He had drilled into 14-year-old Elizabeth that if he was forced to kill anyone, it would all be her fault. And I think that those points are very important to take note of when asking those questions, because none of this is Elizabeth's fault and she simply did what she could to survive. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee would be arrested and Elizabeth was rescued, returned back home to her parents. It would take 7-ish long years for Elizabeth's case to finally go to trial. Brian had tried every which way he could to delay or disrupt the proceedings. Wanda Barzee would end up taking a plea deal where she pled guilty to the charges of kidnapping, unlawful transportation of a minor, and sexual assault of a child. For this, she received a sentence of 15 years. As part of her plea deal, she testified against her husband. During her phase, she directly apologised to Elizabeth and asked for forgiveness. Much to the devastation and disappointment of Elizabeth, Wanda was released from prison in September 2018 with 5 years supervision. She had to register as a sex offender, and part of her conditions with that is that she wasn't allowed to go near play parks and areas which were highly populated with children. She violated this in 2025 and was arrested but not reincarcerated. She still lives in Salt Lake City, where Elizabeth could potentially bump into her anytime, and how she dares to show her face there, I have no idea. Brian David Mitchell would eventually be convicted of kidnapping, unlawful transportation of a minor in foreign commerce for illegal sexual activity. For this, he received 2 whole life terms without the possibility of parole. He is still serving his sentence, and as of 2024, he was serving his sentence within a high-security Indiana prison, but according to a 2025 report, he was removed from the prison because he kept getting attacked and the guards were allowing it to happen. Elizabeth Smart didn't let what happened to her define her or shape the rest of her life. If anything, when she returned back home, she tried to pick up where she left off. She graduated high school and attended Brigham Young University, where she studied music performance. She did her Mormon missionary work in Paris, France, which she momentarily had to leave so that she could testify within her trial. But while here, she would meet Scotsman Matthew Gilmore, who she went on to marry, and the couple now share 3 beautiful children. Elizabeth has dedicated so much of her life work to being an activist, a voice for survivors and victims. In her early 20s, she set up the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, which aims to prevent sexual exploitation, empower children, and provide resources and support for both victims and families. She is very active on her Instagram, where she radiates happiness, positivity, and a love for life. If you've made it this far and still haven't listened to part 1, make sure to go ahead and listen to that right now, because this episode may seem incomplete, but I promise everything that's missing from this episode is in the other one. Today's episode I am classing as this week's case. I didn't want to leave us all waiting a whole week for a part 2. So there's not going to be a new episode uploaded on Friday, but I will catch you all next Friday with a brand new episode. Thank you so much for joining me for today's case. Don't forget to follow the podcast wherever you're listening so that you never miss a new upload. You can find photos and updates over on the Instagram at TrueCrimeCaitlyn. I appreciate you all for being here, and I'll catch you all on the next one.